Please rise for the entrance of Her Honor, the Honorable Salma Lakhani, Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, and His Honor, Dr. Zahir Lakhani. Thank you. Please be seated. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. My name is Dr. Carrie Smith, and I currently serve as Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I am delighted to welcome you to today's event, which kicks off a month of activities to honor and celebrate Islamic History Month, which is recognized across Canada each October. It aims to celebrate, inform, educate, and share with fellow Canadians the rich Muslim heritage and contributions to society. It is also a time to acknowledge the ongoing challenges and barriers that Muslim Canadians face and how we can do better as a university. I would now like to invite the Lieutenant Governor to offer her remarks.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to everyone. Welcome to our special guest here, Professor Jasmin Zine. And you know, I understand there's a heat wave in your part of Canada, right? So we're lucky here. We managed just for you to keep the snow away and then make sure there was a bit of sunshine. I'd like to welcome you to this. And I just heard from Dr. Carrie Smith that this is the first time that the university is sponsoring and hosting Islamic History Month. Is that correct, Dr. Madawi? I know in the past it's been ECMC who sponsors these lectures, but the university is hosting and sponsoring the Islamic History Month for the first time this year, right? We're really thankful for that. So welcome to all of you, and as was mentioned, October is Islamic History Month, and this tradition has been going on for, I believe, 17 years across Canada, which is amazing. So as I always do, I acknowledge all First Peoples who call this place home for thousands of years and who welcomed us here to make our own lives. May we always dwell together on these lands with respect, understanding, and a sincere commitment to walking the journey of reconciliation, and now I say reconciliation. Every one of us should participate in this journey. You know, reconciliation means different things to different people, and I urge all of you to try and somehow get involved in this journey. So as Lieutenant Governor, I am always so honored and privileged to meet people of diverse cultures, and each time I meet somebody from a different culture than mine, it's inspiring and it's learning opportunity. And I always say this job, that is my joy, that is the gift I get for being Lieutenant Governor. I wouldn't know about so many cultures and peoples if I wasn't in this position. And when I was appointed to this position, all those who wanted to interview me and chat with me in the beginning, the one question they had for me was, you are the first Muslim Lieutenant Governor in all of Canada. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? And I thought about it and I said, you know, my appointment speaks to the story of Canada. because Canada is made up of so many diverse peoples. Apart from our first peoples, our ancestors, have come from somewhere else. So it speaks to the promise of Canada. And it also speaks to the hope and promise and the story. But for Canada to be the great country that it can be, I always say we need to work a little bit harder. Because there should be no discrimination, no Islamophobia. Everyone should be felt included. And when I say included, I don't just mean tokenism. I mean real inclusion. So this is what Canada is all about, and we are so lucky to be living here, but all of us need to work that little bit harder to make that promise and hope be felt by every single person who calls this home. And at this point, I'd like to acknowledge the incredible work that the Edmonton Council of Muslim Communities is doing under I see the past chair, Masood up there. I don't know if Dr. Iqbal Batu is here. Is he here? And Jasmin Zine. They're doing amazing work to build bridges with other communities, to educate people. And that is how we build a truly vibrant and inclusive community for all. And I'd also like to say, I'm so happy to see people who are not Muslims in this room, because I attend a lot of events organized for Black History Month and Hindu Cultural Month and Chinese the Lunar New Year. And when I get there for Black History Month, I see all Black people in the audience. When I go for Lunar New Year, I see all Asian people in the audience. When I go for Hindu Cultural Month, I see all Hindu people there. Well, that's wonderful. But we need to include and invite people of other faiths and cultures to these events. That is how we tell them who we are as Muslims. And so I'd like to really thank the ECMC for the amazing work you are doing in that area. I'd like to thank all volunteers and leaders. And you know, October is Islamic History Month. But we as Muslims let other communities know who we are and what we are through our words and our actions every single day. We know about all the Muslim pioneers who came here in those early days from what we now call Lebanon. And they went to the most remote parts of our province. A lot of them integrated with our first peoples. They learned their way of life, they learned their culture, they learned their languages. And some of you might know of, I think his name is Omar Mograbi, who was the past mayor of Lac La Biche, who speaks fluent Cree. And when I met him, I was amazed. I mean, I've only learned a few words in my position in the Cree language, in the Blackfoot language. But he speaks fluent Cree. He really assimilated with the first peoples there. And to truly accept one another, we have to learn about one another's cultures. So with that, I know I have all these notes that I have right in front of me, but I don't want to take up too much time because we are here today to listen to and learn from our keynote speaker, Professor Jasmin Zine. We're all looking forward to it, and every time we get an opportunity to have people like you, Professor, we all look forward to it. We look forward to learning from you, and we look forward to sharing with other people what we're doing. And I'd like to say a big thank you to our host, Dr. Carrie Smith, Dr. Hamden, of course, our very esteemed ECMC chair in Islamic Studies, Dr. Motjiba Madawi, who invited me to be here. Thank you so much for including us, Dr. Madawi. Thank you.
I would now like to introduce Dr. Madawi. Dr. Mojtaba Madawi is Professor of Political Science and the ECMC Chair in Islamic Studies at the University of Alberta. He is the author and editor of numerous works on post-Islamism, contemporary social movements, and democratization in the Middle East and North Africa. post-revolutionary Iran, and modern Islamic political thought. Dr. Mahdavi's research lies at the intersection of critical Middle East studies, political economy, contemporary Islamic studies, and decolonial, post-colonial studies. Dr. Mahdavi, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Allow me to welcome you, each and every one of you, to this special event in celebration of the Islamic History Month, the month of October in Canada. This year, we are very pleased to celebrate this special month and event with the presence of our guest of honor, the Honorable Salma Lakhani, the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, the first female Muslim in this position, and also His Honor Lakhani at the same time. We are also very fortunate to have Professor Jasmin Zine as our distinguished keynote speaker. I'll be introducing Professor Zine very briefly. I'm not unable to do the justice because of his extensive publication and a strong CV, but just a few words and sentence to introduce Dr. Jasmin Zine. As a professor of sociology and religion and culture at Wilfrid Laurier University, her publications include Under Siege, Islamophobia, and the 9/11 Generation 2022, which is the topic of this talk today, and also the book is outside for you to consider buying, and of course, signed by Dr. Zine at the same time. This book provides an ethnographic study of experiences of Muslim youth navigating Islamophobia and the global war on terror. This book was named on the Hill Times list of the best books in Canada in 2022. She's also the author of the Canadian Islamophobia Industry, Mapping Islamophobia's Ecosystem in the Great White North, again in 2022. Dr. Zine has worked as a consultant with the UNESCO, the Council of Europe, among many other major organizations. As a public intellectual, she has testified in parliamentary meetings and Canadian Senate Committee on Human Rights. Dr. Zine is the co-founder and vice president of the International Islamophobia Studies Research Association. With that, please welcome Dr. Zine to this podium.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Peace to everyone. Welcome this evening. I'd like to begin with some thanks to so many people who made this evening possible. I want to thank, in the outset, Dr. Evelyn Hamden, who is the Senior Advisor of Equity and Human Rights, who worked very hard to bring me here today, Dr. Carrie Smith, Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Mojtaba Mahdavi, who is our Professor of Political Science and ECMC Chair in Islamic Studies. I met with some wonderful PhD students yesterday, and that was convened by Ihsan Kashifi, who's a PhD candidate here, an instructor in Department of Political Science. And there was a lot of support from folks in the Faculty of Arts and Resource Center, Claire Peters and Grant Wang, Cindy Welsh, Events Manager in the Faculty of Arts, Frank Page, University of Alberta Protective Services, Jordan Cook, Partner, Communications and Marketing, Adam Medaglia, University of Alberta Bookstore. So there were many, many people who worked very hard to bring me here and to have this event and to have all of you here in honor of Islamic History Month. So I'm very grateful to all of them. I'm very honored to have been here when our Honorable Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, Salma Lakhani, was present with us to speak as an opening address and to mark Islamic History Month and remind us that this was the first year that the university itself was sponsoring the event. And so I think this is an auspicious occasion and time, and I'm grateful for that. And being here to mark that and to celebrate that with everyone. Although I am aware that the content of my research isn't necessarily spiritually uplifting, because I am talking about some very serious issues to deal with Islamophobia. in Canada. As much as we are happy to have an opportunity to celebrate and honor Islamic History Month, we have to also acknowledge and recognize some of the deep issues in this country around anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. And so that's where my work has been focused for quite some time. And so I do appreciate being here and being able to share some of my more current research on the 9/11 generation of Muslim youth who were socialized and grew up in a world which was undergoing a global war on terror. There was heightened Islamophobia after 9/11, and they had to navigate a very different world, although they didn't know much of the world that came before. And so I was very interested in how Canadian Muslim youth were dealing with some of those challenges, and that is what brought me to this work. I wanted to start by talking about Muslim children and childhood and how that has been impacted by Islamophobia. And when we think of childhood, we think of the innocence that children have. And unfortunately, for a lot of Muslim children, I mean, not just in Canada, but globally, because so much of what is going on in the world, if we look around in places like China and in Burma and in India and in Palestine and in many, many other countries, Kashmir, childhood has been disrupted by war, by genocide, by terror, by all sorts of violence and disruption to the lives of children. In Canada as well, we are not immune to the disruption of Muslim children's lives. And so when we think about that innocence that was lost, there's a few examples I want to flag. The first one is under the banner of the no-fly kids list. This the no-fly list refers to people who are named as potential threats to national security, and so their names get flagged at the airport. And so that is a way of trying to safeguard the country from people who might be at risk of committing violent acts. Quite often, there are names on that list that are similar to names that were flagged, and there are other names that are not bona fide risks and threats, and some of those names have been Muslim toddlers and children. There was one famous case of a young boy, and you see him in the middle of that picture with the Montreal Canadiens shirt, because in fact he was trying to go to see his favorite team play in Montreal, and was getting on a plane with his dad, but was prevented from doing so because his name matched the name of somebody that was on the no-fly list. And as these stories started to come to light, there was a growing number of Muslim children from, babies and toddlers all the way to, teenagers who were unable to fly because their names were similar to people who were part of this Passenger Protect program, and they have been dubbed the no-fly list. And so that's one way some of the policies around securitization that have been implemented in the post-9/11 context have impacted Muslim children whose names may be similar to those people who are not deemed unsafe to fly. The other image here, you'll see a little boy in the middle image who's holding up very proudly a clock that he made at home. It was a project that he took on upon himself to make a clock. He was fascinated by science, and he went to school the next day. Now, this wasn't in Canada, it was in the United States. His name was Ahmed. He was about 10 years old, and he brought that clock in to show his teacher. He was very excited. The teacher thought that he built a bomb. The police were called. The picture you see there with Ahmed looking very distressed and in handcuffs in the school office was the result of that. So again, we see childhood innocence lost when, an innocent act of a child making a clock is read as he's produced a bomb because of the kind of negative associations that are attached to Muslim bodies when it comes to terrorism and potential threats to public safety. Ahmed was actually quite famously lauded by the president at the time, Barack Obama, who put out a tweet that said, cool clock, Ahmed, why don't you bring it to the White House? We need to encourage more kids to do science. So he did get that opportunity to go and visit the White House and bring his clock. But unfortunately, what the family experienced around this situation, they were forced to leave and go back to leave Canada and go back home. I believe they were from Libya. And the final example I want to give in the corner here, you can see a child's drawing. So this was a drawing of a kindergarten-age child. This was in the United Kingdom. A child drew this picture. When the teacher asked, well, what did you draw? The child said, a cooker bum. In the UK, there is a policy called the Prevent policy, which requires teachers and even preschool teachers to identify if they think a child, and even a toddler, in their care might become a radical. They have a duty under this policy to report that. This teacher thought this kindergarten child, when he said he drew a cooker bum, said a cooker bomb. So child services were called in, the Prevent authorities were called in, and it was only later that they discovered that what the child was trying to say was he was drawing a picture of his dad cutting a cucumber. So the cucumber cooker bomb, again, innocence that becomes perverted through the countering violent extremism policies that were ushered in the post 9/11 era and have been used to surveil not just adults but children and even toddlers. So it's always staggering to me to think about what does it mean to be, a preschool teacher, and what does it look like to have a radical toddler in diapers, But that is the policy and that is the expectation. And unfortunately, Muslim children are often the ones that are marked as potential radicals, even when they are in diapers. So I wanted to share that as a preface to my discussion of the 9/11 generation and the experiences they have growing up and in Canada. It was interesting, before I came here, I was in Banff, and I was buying tickets to some of the attractions there, and a woman asked me what I was doing in Alberta, and I told her I was coming here to do a talk, and I was promoting a book, and she's like, well, what's the book about? And I told her it's about, the 9/11 generation and what they've experienced after 9/11, Muslim youth, and she's like, oh, it must be about the United States then. And I said, no, it's about Canada. And she was puzzled. She just looked at me like, how is that possible? And yet it is, and we have to move beyond this idea of Canadian exceptionalism that, these are things and problems that are just south of the border. I think you will see through my discussion how so much of Islamophobia is actually homegrown here in Canada. I'm often asked, what motivated me to do this study and this research. And there were three primary drivers that I want to share with you, and they're drawn from my own experience. One of the first was the experience that my sons had growing up as part of the 9/11 generation. When 9/11 happened, my older son was around 13 and my other son was around 10. And my older son is named Osama, which was not an easy name to have after 9/11, and he was subject to harassment because of that, death threats in his locker, he was routinely called Bin Laden and so on. My younger son, Yusuf, is an actor, and he's been an actor since of age 13, and after a while he found he was getting typecast and consistently being asked to come in and read for the role of terrorist number 2. So those were some experiences that my own children had, and that I realized that the world had changed in a way that was really casting their identities in a particular way, and they had to navigate that. In ways that, I grew up in Canada. I came here when I was 3 as an immigrant from Pakistan, and I grew up in a very white community. So I had my own challenges, and later I moved to Toronto. And when I was at the University of Toronto, I became part of the Muslim Student Association and became very active. And that was in the late 1980s and 90s. And I was thinking about some of the events that we did. I don't know if there's any Muslim students here, but we do a lot of events on campus. Even then, we were doing Islamic Awareness Week regularly, among other events. And one of the things we did, we were doing fundraising. Muslim students often do a lot of fundraising events for charities abroad and orphans and such. We held an event that I often think of, if we held that event today, how would it be perceived? because we were doing a fundraiser for a group called Human Concern International, which at the time was led by the Qadr family, who have become very well known in Canada now because Omar al-Qadr, who I think is now living in Edmonton, had later on, not at this time, being sent to Guantanamo Bay and was held there as an enemy combatant. The Qadr family at the time were doing humanitarian work in Afghanistan, which was under Russian occupation. Americans were allies at the time, and the Mujahideen were freedom fighters and so on. So we were raising money for orphans and children and things there. But we had this fundraiser in a Catholic school gymnasium. We needed security because there were lots of people coming. We were selling goods from, we had booths from Somalia, from Morocco, from Guyana. We were selling food and all of these things. So we needed security. So we got Afghan Mujahideen fighters who were in Canada for rehabilitation to come with their walkie-talkies and patrol around the school, wearing long tunics and turbans and long beards. And I just thought if that scene was repeated today, it would be, we would have CSIS, the RCMP, every security agency converging on site. So I realized how much things had changed, and the kind of, events that we were able to hold, carried very different meaning if they were held today. And then the final example, the third driver for this study, was seeing one of my students, who I was teaching at the University of Toronto, wanting to join a nonviolent reactionary Islamist group because they were using Islamophobia as a rallying cry for followers to adhere to their very narrow worldview about setting up a global caliphate. And I was very surprised, this student in particular, because he was such a social justice activist. He, the girls all had crushes on him, like he was man about campus. And, he used to wait for me and take the shuttle with me and have a notebook full of questions. And those questions started to turn toward a group called the Hizb ut-Tahrir. And I didn't know very much about them, but I started to research when he asked me about them, because he was joining up with members of this group who had sort of, started to organize in Canada. And I found that they were a group that was actually banned in the UK. They weren't a group that promoted any kind of violence, although there were violent offshoots of this group, Muhajirun, for example. But they were working within Muslim communities to create a gradual change and eventually wanted to see Muslims governed by a central caliphate or authority. And I found this kind of troubling and problematic. And what struck me was, why would this young person who, was so much into, he had started a Muslims for Social Justice on campus, why would he be drawn to this particular kind of ideology? And then I found that they were using Islamophobia as a way to recruit these youth by saying, look, this country doesn't accept you. They treat you like second-class citizens, so come join us because we're building a different future. So I started to realize that there is a nexus between Islamophobia and certain forms of Islamism, and that it was important to address Islamophobia as well and understand that nexus and how it plays into the recruiting of youth for some of these more problematic kinds of movements. And so all of that, those drivers prompted me, to embark on this research. The group that I'm looking at has been dubbed the 9/11 generation, the group of millennial youth. Of course, there are 9/11 generation youth in other countries as well, and there have been studies about youth in other countries of the similar generation. The 9/11 generation of Canadian Muslims came of age under unique circumstances where their identities became overnight reconfigured as radicals and jihadists. They were serving as a foil that made the Western imperial project seem, reasonable, intelligible, and just, right? Because we need that boogeyman and that enemy. And so other scholars before me have tried to look at some of these experiences. And at the University of Toronto, there was a survey done of 120 Muslim university students by Katie and McDonald, and they found that 94% of them agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, quote, "I see a change in the way that others view me since 9/11. Another study on the 9/11 generation in the United States by Sinina Myra found that American Muslim youth in the post-9/11 context asserted that, quote, living with, accommodating, or resisting surveillance are a part of the coming-of-age experiences of the 9/11 generation. And then finally, of Australian youth found that those youth, when they were coming of age in this time of global war and terror and heightened Islamophobia, found that they felt the need to tame their Muslimness, to strategically erase and conceal their identities. So what we're seeing is, in many Western nations, that this generation of youth were growing up under the specter of this global war on terror, on a heightened Islamophobia, and the transformation of their identities overnight from peaceful citizens to potential terrorists and radicals. And so I was interested in examining what this meant and how youth navigate those experiences. And it took me back to the book by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903 called The Souls of Black Folk. And Du Bois talks about something called double consciousness. I'll just read the quote. "It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, through measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity." And he talked about that in his book through the question, how does it feel to be a problem? And I thought that quote and that question very much resonated with the kind of question I was trying to look at and the experience of Muslim youth as well. And so my research draws attention to the way the 9/11 generation is grappling with Du Bois's question and how they feel and react to being constructed as a problem in Canada. So a little bit about the research that I did. This was a Canada-wide study. I interviewed 130 Muslim youth from New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. There were also youth leaders that I spoke to, youth workers. The youth that I interviewed were from 23 ethno-racial groups. They were predominantly Sunni and some Shia youth. Those interviews were, as I mentioned, conducted across Canada from 2009 to 2015, and then a couple of years after, I was always going back to some of these groups of youth and talking about what I was understanding from their narratives and getting more feedback from them. So it was very much a kind of collaborative theorizing that went into this study. So my book covers a lot of ground, but I'm just going to talk about three primary areas. And the first are the affective registers of Islamophobia and how post-9/11 identities were constructed and constituted, and how Muslim youth adapted to those new kinds of identities. As well as Islamophobia and the security industrial complex. The securitization of Muslim youth is a big part of what happened after 9/11 and how they were consistently being surveilled and continue to be surveilled. But I also wanted to look at resistance. I didn't want to end the book on the note that Muslim youth were just sort of victims of circumstances that were outside of their control. I wanted to show how they were using the arts in particular as a way to resist the kinds of marginalities they were experiencing, to speak back to power, and to create counter-narratives. So I'm going to talk about these three themes in my presentation today. But let's start with something more basic in terms of what is Islamophobia. It's often a very misunderstood term. What it sounds like when you add phobia to a term is that it speaks to a kind of fear or irrational fear. But Islamophobia is not an irrational fear or hatred of Islam alone. It is actually something that, rather than being an irrational fear, it's actually rooted in various kinds of racial logics that have a long history and genealogy. Islamophobia didn't just begin on September 12th, right? It didn't just start in the aftermath of 9/11. What Islamophobia refers to is demonizing Islam or Muslims and anyone who is perceived as Muslim. You may recall that the first person who was killed in reprisal for the 9/11 attacks was a Sikh man, at a gas station in New York City. So anyone who is perceived to be Muslim, can be subject to Islamophobia. Barack Obama, who was the most powerful man in the world, was often accused of being Muslim and therefore was also subject to forms of Islamophobia. Now, what Islamophobia doesn't mean is that you cannot be critical of Islam, as you would any other religion. It refers more to the vilification and demonization, but it doesn't mean that people cannot be critical of Islam. It is not taking away people's ability to critique. There's also a term called anti-Muslim racism that is used often interchangeably, or sometimes people prefer that term, anti-Muslim racism, to Islamophobia. I see Islamophobia as a broader framework within which anti-Muslim racism is a manifestation of the discrimination that Muslim bodies are subject to. And that's rooted in the racialization of religion, how certain racial characteristics become ascribed to various religions. And so that is kind of a bridge between Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, is that racialization of religion. But Islamophobia has a long history and genealogy. It's rooted in colonialism and Orientalism, although it also predates the modern period. Islamophobic bigotry and hate have existed for a very long time. But what's important in terms of how I understand Islamophobia as a sociologist is that we need to talk about how that hate is translated into individual actions and is underwritten by negative ideologies and stereotypes that then find expression in law and policy. So it's understanding those dynamics of Islamophobia through individual actions, through the ideas and ideologies that support, legitimate, and justify those actions, and then how those ideas become then expressed through law and policy. And I'm going to flesh that out a little bit more because I think it's important to understand those dynamics. But before I do, it's also important to understand that Islamophobia is intersectional. Islamophobia is lived differently according to the specific social identities of Muslims. And let's remember there's about 2 billion Muslims in the world today. And all too often what Islamophobia does is collapse everybody into a singular sort of unitary category. But Muslims are very diverse. There's different gendered and racialized registers through which Islamophobia is experienced. And some of those include gendered forms of Islamophobia. And we're talking about specific forms of discrimination that are leveled against Muslim women, although gendered Islamophobia can also refer to Muslim men as well. And those come from colonial histories and Orientalist stereotypes that still persist today. But it's also intersectional with forms of anti-Arab racism, and part of that too now we talk about anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Black racism, anti-brown racism. All of those are intersectional with Islamophobia. And Islamophobia, as we know, has had very deadly consequences in this country. You see the images here of the victims of the Quebec mosque shooting that took place in 2017 at the hands of a white nationalist. 6 Muslim men were gunned down during evening prayers in a mosque in Sainte-Foy, Quebec. And more recently in 2021 in London, Ontario on June 6th, where a Pakistani Muslim family, the Afzal family, were out for an evening stroll, were intentionally mowed down by a truck and killed 4 members of that family, and a 9-year-old boy was injured and fighting for his life. Some of you may be following the trial of the assailant in that case in Windsor right now, Nathaniel Veltman. And if you are getting some insight into how white nationalists are, because he describes himself not as a white supremacist, but as a white nationalist, are viewing the Muslim presence in Canada as an imminent threat, as an existential threat. It's quite chilling if you watch any of the interviews, his police interrogation, in terms of how he found it so easy in the end to put his foot on the pedal and to mow down this family, even though it hurt his soul. And it was interesting hearing that particular line in his testimony, because that line is taken from the manifesto of Brendan Tarrant, who was the shooter in New Zealand who killed 51 Muslims a year before. So Canada has a unique and problematic kind of experience of acts of terror against Muslim citizens in this country. And that makes it all the more necessary and urgent for us to understand, unpack, address Islamophobia and its impact on Muslim communities. So when I talked about those dynamics of Islamophobia on an individual level, an ideological level, and systemic level, I want to unpack that a little bit. So when we talk about individual level, if we imagine this as an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is what's above the water. Those are the kind of individual actions that if you heard about this, you would understand that, okay, this was an Islamophobic incident. And what we don't see are what's below the water, and those are the kind of ideologies and systemic practices that are very much shaping and supporting those individual actions. But those individual actions are things like everything from name-calling or daily microaggressions that Muslims may experience, especially, visibly marked Muslims who then, particularly Muslim women who, may get more questioning or negative assumptions attached to them because of their identity. Various forms of exclusion, physical, sexual harassment and violence, vandalism, and of course, hate crimes, which, as we know, have become deadly in this country. Some of the images you're seeing here, well, two of them actually are from Edmonton, the mosque here, which had a swastika spray painted on it, so that is an act of vandalism. There were a spate of attacks of Black Muslim women in Edmonton. I think at one time there were 3 in a week, and those are examples of violent forms of gendered Islamophobia. We see other forms of vandalism, this poster of a Muslim woman who was running for school trustee who had the poster defaced. And the middle, you see the pig's head. This is a pig's head wrapped in cellophane and blue and white ribbon representing the Quebec flag. And this pig's head was dropped at the mosque where the Quebec shooting took place 1 year before the attack took place. The pig's head was placed there with a card that read Bon Appetit. So that was a kind of rehearsal for the violence that was to take place a year later. So these are some of the kinds of acts that we know as individual actions that occur at the tip of that iceberg. Again, what's below the water, what's propping up those actions, what's justifying and rationalizing those particular kinds of actions. And those are the kinds of ideologies and increasingly conspiracy theories about Muslims. So I call these ideas Islamophobia's playlist, because some of them are oldies and not so goodies, but they've been around for quite a while. So the basic tunes of this are the fact that Muslims are illiberal, anti-democratic, and incompatible with Canadian values, that Muslim women are oppressed. Those are the standards. They've been around for a very long time. What we're starting to see now, particularly through Islamophobia networks that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, are the promotion of conspiracy theories. And these are some that are prominent in Canada as well as elsewhere. And, if you think about that adage that says, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. And so some of these conspiracy theories and Muslim scare stories have gained a lot of traction in particular circles, and not just in the far right, unfortunately, but there's ideas of the Islamist boogeyman, which is this notion that Muslims are here in the West and want to take over and are going to install a caliphate in Canada and elsewhere in the West, and they'll do that through a kind of being a Trojan horse. So that Trojan horse is another big and very popular narrative in far-right Islamophobic subcultures, as is this notion of Muslims as invaders. I don't have the image here, but in my report on the Islamophobia industry, I show an image where in one of the Islamophobic subcultural groups, far-right white nationalist groups, they had an image of the Afzal family who was killed in the London terror attack. A lot of people have seen that image, and over it they wrote "Dead Invaders." That was from Terrorgram, actually. And in fact, when you kill a Muslim, you become a saint in that subculture. So Nathaniel Veltman is now known as Saint Nathaniel within that particular far-right white nationalist subculture. And so the Muslim invader trope is a very powerful and destructive one. This idea also of creeping Sharia, that, well, how are they going to take over? They're going to institute Sharia law and take over. And turn Western nations into, Islamic societies and eventually a, global caliphate. We know about the jihadist terrorist type of tropes as well. There's also the demographic replacement theories that Muslims are very much front and center in those kinds of theories that, well, they're going to take over, but not just civilizationally. They're going to take over because they are going to overpopulate Western nations. And so that demographic threat or biopolitical threat that Muslims now embody has become very much central to the kinds of conspiracy theories that circulate within anti-Muslim subcultures. Also the notion of taqiyya, or deception, that, well, Muslims are wolves in sheep's clothing. They'll smile at you, they'll be friendly, don't believe them. They're here to take over you, your land, and your country. Those are some of the ideas, and they are supported by the weaponization of the Quran, where they will take verses of the Quran out of context and use those as a way to demonstrate that this is a violent, inherently violent culture, and it breeds violent people, and so on. So those are some of the tactics and strategies. You can see some of the images that I have here that depict some of those conspiracy theories and ideologies. Those ideas are promoted more increasingly through Islamophobia networks. So the other study that I just did and released last year was on the Canadian Islamophobia industry, and it talks about how Islamophobia is organized, it's orchestrated, it is monetized as well. The Islamophobia industry is comprised of media outlets, Islamophobia influencers, as I've called them. We know some of these in Canada through the stars of Rebel Media, Faith Goldie, Lauren Southern, for example. Far-right white nationalist groups. In Canada, there's about 300 far-right white nationalist groups of different sizes and stripes. At their core, most of them have Islamophobic ideas and sentiments. There are pro-Israel fringe right groups. Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims are also part of these campaigns. There are think tanks, and there are donors that support these campaigns. In the United States, the research on the Islamophobia industry donors has showed that about $1.5 billion circulates among 39 groups whose raison d'etre, or main reason for being, is to promote Islamophobic propaganda and campaigns. These individuals, groups, and institutions comprise a global network that supports activities that demonize and marginalize Islam and Muslims. So it's important to recognize that, Islamophobia is a unique form of oppression because it has an industry behind its promotion that is working 24/7 to propagate Islamophobic ideologies, conspiracy theories, and to promote campaigns. And there's many of them that are described in my book. They're supported through various media outlets and so on. So I just wanted to flag that aspect of Islamophobia that I think is very unique to the way that Islamophobia is purveyed. I've been talking about the far right and the fringe kind of elements in this country and elsewhere that are major promoters of Islamophobia. But I looked at the polls in Canada over the last 2 decades to get a sense of public opinion. And how does the Muslim presence resonate more broadly among Canadians? And it was unfortunate to find that it's not that different than what we hear from the far right echo chambers. For example, in 2017, a Radio Canada poll found that nearly 1 out of 4 Canadians would favor a ban on Muslim immigration to Canada. And in Quebec, that support grew to 32%. So 2017 was after Donald Trump came into power south of the border and instituted what was dubbed the Muslim ban. To find out that 1/4 of Canadians would have supported a similar ban, I think, was surprising. The same poll also revealed that most respondents, 51% in Canada and 57% in Quebec, felt that the presence of Muslims in this country made them somewhat or very worried about security. So that's, again, a high number of people that are worried and troubled by the Muslim presence in this country. In 2015, a national poll found that 68% of Canadians disagreed with allowing Muslim women to wear niqab or burqa during citizenship ceremonies, and 72% agreed that the burqa or niqab are symbols of oppression and rooted in a culture that is anti-woman. So again, very high numbers of Canadians that have very negative associations with Muslim women's sartorial choices. And then finally, a survey earlier in 2012 that were measuring Canadian attitudes towards religion and multiculturalism found that 52% of Canadians distrust Muslims. And 42% believed that discrimination against Muslims was pretty much their own fault. So a lot of the victim blaming, but high levels of distrust and of fear and concern about Muslims in Canada. And these are mainstream polls. This isn't just the far-right echo chamber here. So those were disturbing statistics. It brought me to think about something that I call liberal Islamophobia, where there's a kind of paradox. We have on the one hand in this country values of equity, diversity, and inclusion that are espoused and celebrated, yet at the same time we have policies and practices that target Muslims as being suspect or backward minorities. On the one hand, we have Islamic History Month. We have other kinds of celebrations. There will be, a stamp for Eid that's created. There's, various other ways in which, Islamic culture is celebrated as part of multiculturalism. And yet we still have policies that target Muslims in certain ways for scrutiny. We've seen recently the Canada Revenue Agency has been, there's a charter challenge there because they have been targeting Muslim charities for scrutiny under the belief that they are funding terrorism abroad, for example. So there's a lot of different ways in which the state is still involved in singling out Muslims for a particular kind of negative attention. So I see this as a kind of nexus of desire and disavowal where liberal Islamophobia arises when Islamophilia kind of meets, marked by cultural fascination and fetishism, meets Islamophobia. And that spans across the political spectrum. When I say liberal, I don't mean the Liberal Party. I'm talking about this as a broader-based kind of phenomenon. And more than other extreme variants of Islamophobia that I've been talking about, liberal Islamophobia does a lot more damage. It does the work of normalizing anti-Muslim racism and giving it greater legitimacy and institutional power. So I wanted to also flag that as part of the backdrop. Just to quickly go over some of the systemic factors. Again, these are the systemic issues and forms of discrimination against Muslims in Canada. I talked already about the no-fly list, the Passenger Protect program. We see racial profiling, whether in communities, in schools, in borders, this flying while Muslim phenomenon, surveillance and securitization through security certificates, the Anti-Terrorism Act, so on. Bans on religious attire, we know about Law 21 in Quebec. There have been similar bans in schools, in sports, citizenship ceremonies. Again, the sartorial choices of Muslim women have become an ideological battleground for gendered forms of Islamophobia, actually globally. We've had the zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices, Quebec Charter of Values, and then there's a lot more research coming out, studies on discrimination in employment, housing, healthcare, education, social services, and goes on and on. So there's quite a lot of data and information about systemic forms of Islamophobia. So all of that was a backdrop to contextualize the research that I've done on the 9/11 generation. And so what I want to share with you now are some of the quotes of participants that I interviewed. This is very much a narrative-driven study and book. This is a quote from a Somali youth worker in Toronto, Robley. He says that since 9/11, the focus has been on the religion and Muslimness and what it means vis-a-vis the press coverage, where the focus is on those who are extremist and use Islamic language to further their agenda. This has also become linked with regular Muslim youth. So Muslim youth now have to answer the questions of terrorism, extremism, and not fitting in because they are extreme. They don't belong to these categories, but they have to deal with them now. So if you're a religious youth who attends the mosque regularly and wants to have a religiously centered life, the assumption is that you are an extremist. And we know that being religious and being extremist are not the same thing. Every time somebody blows something up in the world and they're Muslims, it's a reflection on their identity and that stereotypes and assumptions made against them. And that can affect them in the workplace and in classrooms. Because guaranteed, when a terror attack happens somewhere in the world, the very next day, if you are Muslim and people know it, you will be questioned on the subway, at work, at school, right? There will be some way in which you are called into account for those actions. And that was also part of the kind of collective guilt that was leveled on Muslim communities as a result of 9/11. And the entire Muslim, world of 2 billion people were held accountable for those actions. So a lot of youth understood this and picked up on it and articulated what it meant to face that kind of labeling. Here, Sikandar, a Bengali student in Ontario, says, I guess the single biggest negative impact was that the mainstream majority now probably suspects every other young Muslim male with a basketball jersey or engineering degree to be a potential truck bomber. You know, as a university student, and he was someone in engineering who knew that, you know, there was a time that if you were trying to come to Canada to study engineering and you were from a Muslim country, the presumption was that you were going to come and try and build bombs. So it was very difficult if you were doing chemistry or engineering to get into programs. Again, that kind of collective labeling affected their lives a number of ways. So that burden of collective guilt and responsibility was something I heard over and over again in the narratives of the students the youth that I interviewed. This is Rania, who is an Egyptian student, and she was talking about what happened in the aftermath of September 11 when she was in school. And she said, the day of September 11th, we were watching the Twin Towers falling. And I remember my grade 7 world cultures teacher came and pointed her finger in my face and said, tell your people to stop attacking Americans. I was a very sarcastic child, and I was always made fun of because I wore hijab since grade 3. So as my defense mechanism, I wouldn't cry. I would always just say something sarcastic. So I remember I was really on the defensive because I was very emotional, and I was like, okay, hand me a phone and I'll call my Uncle Bin Laden. So humor became sometimes a way as a kind of escape valve for the tensions and a way of responding, because always a response was demanded of these young people, even though this had nothing to do with them or their experience, but they were being called into account and asked to respond. Atika, who was an international student in New Brunswick, put it this way, you know, because if you're Muslim, you're taking the burden of the whole Muslim world. And I liked the way Zahir, the next quote, kind of tried to think about that, trying to unpack that idea. And he says, if you are white, you're simply an individual and you're separate from the rest of society. Whereas if you're a Muslim, you're linked to the whole community. Concerning Islamophobia, it's a daily thing. A lot of work needs to be done to have accurate reporting in the media and to have Canadians at large understand that Muslims are not terrorists blowing up each other or wife beaters. So these youth were very aware of the kinds of stereotypes that were being mapped onto them. Very aware of the fact that to be seen as an individual is a luxury that is not afforded to racialized communities, because you will always be judged as part of a collective. When we look at the 9/11 terror attacks, 19 hijackers, but 2 billion people in the world are held accountable. My son goes to school, his name is Osama, he's bullied. When Timothy McVeigh blows up the Murrah building, the next day, children named Timothy are not being bullied in schools, right? There's a difference. Muslim youth are very aware of that and of understanding how those meanings were being attached to them and what that effect was. In that burden of representation also felt differentially by Muslim women who are visibly marked as Muslim if they are wearing Islamic attire like a headscarf or niqab. And in this case, Sophia, a Somali youth, was saying, when you're in public and you're wearing hijab, you're extremely aware of every action that you take. If you're in a bad mood and you're scowling at everybody, you're a Muslim. It's not just me having a bad day. I'm the Muslim girl. I don't just represent myself anymore. So they were very aware of how their bodily comportment in public would not just possibly, be reflected negatively on themselves, but on everyone else who identified as Muslim. And so that places a heavy burden of representation and responsibility. So what is the result of some of this? I found that there was a kind of dual dynamic that happened, that some youth became very estranged from their identities as Muslim, because if you have a socially devalued identity, you want to distance yourself from that. You want to be seen as acceptable, so you may anglicize your name, dress differently, try to blend in more. But others were more invested in their identities as Muslims. They were maybe not even that invested prior to 9/11, but afterwards, because they were now being called into account as Muslims. Their identities mattered more, and rather than, retreating from that identity or becoming estranged from it, they became more invested in it because they wanted to be an image corrective. They wanted to show people who we really are. And this was Mustafa, an African-American imam who was in Canada, and I spoke to him about this phenomenon, and he said, what I've noticed is that the challenges confronting the youth in the post-9/11 context have garnered two very opposite responses. On the one hand, I've found that many Muslim youth have got much closer to their practice of Islam and their identification as Muslims, while on the other hand, because of the frequent abuses they've suffered as a result of their identification, many have assimilated so much into the mainstream identity that it's hard to identify them as Muslims anymore. So that dual dynamic of either estrangement or investment in identity was one of the ways that the very fraught post-9/11 terrain has been navigated by Muslim youth. A lot of them were very concerned about being the image corrective, setting the record straight. So how we behave, we need to be a good example and show people that we're kind, we're good, we are good citizens, and we're not going to blow up the parliament buildings, right? So this was something that these youth thought about very consciously. Bushra says, everything you do, you think of your religion first and how it would impact your religion, like the way you act. So you censor yourself so that people don't see Islam negatively. Miguel says, we should always be at our best in everything we do and remember that as soon as we step out of our homes, we are Muslims. Your body language is very important. How you smile, walk, talk, just to monitor yourself on a constant basis is important. We should always remember that we are responsible for the image of Islam. So again, a very heavy burden of both trying to correct that image, and I would hear youth talk about, well, if I'm on the subway, I will make sure I'll give up my chair to an older person, or I'll pick up the litter, or I'll do something. And that wasn't done disingenuously. They did see that as a representation of their faith, or a way of showing that, we are good citizens, we are taught to look after our environment, to look after elders, to be good to people. But they also were aware that, it was necessary messaging too for others to actually see Muslims in that light, because in fact there were no counter narratives to the negative stereotypes that were otherwise framing their identity. So another issue that I talk about in the book has to do with surveillance, and I think this will resonate here because we are in a university setting, and a lot of the surveillance of Muslim youth has occurred within universities. The RCMP started to talk about the jihadization of Muslim youth as the greatest threat to public safety. So once the security agencies come out with that rhetoric, then the actions start to follow suit. So routinely, Muslim Student Association presidents and executive members have been approached by CSIS, the RCMP, and counterterrorism units of local police, even coming to their homes, coming to campuses. There was a recording device discovered in the prayer room of one of the universities that I was looking at youth's experiences. And youth have even been recruited by CSIS and the RCMP to go into their communities to find information and so on. This topic in particular resonates with me because I was in a situation at my own university where our MSA had been under surveillance. At one point, the president and vice president had been getting calls from a counterterrorism unit in the local police. They were concerned whether do they have to see this counterterrorism unit, they haven't done anything, do they need to speak with the officer? And this is where the political literacy becomes important for youth to understand their rights and responsibilities. And so I let them know that, look, you don't have to, you're under no obligation to speak to them, but if you want to speak to them, I will come to the meeting so that I can look out for your interests. And they realized that they felt that, look, if we don't say yes, they may suspect us even more. So we better just, meet with this. So this counterterrorism officer came on campus, plain clothes, brought Tim Hortons and coffee. I guess that's how you win the hearts and minds, one Timbit at a time. And he was not particularly happy that I was at this meeting because I was asking him some very challenging questions. His message was, look, we just want you to know that terrorism is bad. And if anyone in your group is going to do something violent, we want you to let us know. And it was kind of insulting that would you think that if something violent was going to happen, they're not going to say anything? I started to ask him, okay, well then what do you mean by radical? What do you mean by if someone becomes radicalized? What is that definition? And he's struggled. He's like, well, I mean, I don't know exactly, but And I'm like, no, I don't know. Does that mean if Fatima here starts to cover her face, does that make her a radical? If Salman grows his beard, does that make him a radical? There was no clear definition among security agencies at that time of what it meant. And yet I was very upset about that because it matters. It mattered to us. It mattered to when my sons cross the border, whether they're going to decide that he's a radical and I need to put him over in that line or he needs to be given extra security scrutiny. So it mattered to us what they meant by radicalization, but they didn't have an answer for that. So it became very open-ended. Aside from that meeting, My son was the president of the MSA at his university. And when he was elected, it was an evening. And they didn't even announce the results to the rest of the MSA because it was late. Yet, the next morning at 9 a.m., he got a call from CSIS, right, on his cell phone, saying, well, we heard you're the president of the Muslim Student Association, so we'd like to talk to you about matters of national security. So then we had coffee with CSIS, because that's become a thing for me now. And we still don't know how they knew he was elected. And, again, it was a situation where they wanted to talk about conflict in the community. You need to, let us know if there's a problem. We want you to alert us. And I said, well, this meeting happened right after 3 Muslim students were shot on the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina campus. And so we turned the tables on them, on this agent. And we said, you know what? National security you're talking about, aren't Muslims part of the nation? What about our security? What are you doing about that? And he didn't have an answer. Fast forward a couple of years, 2017, we have the terror attack in Quebec and following that. So this was not on the radar of security agencies, not about protecting Muslims, but protecting the nation from Muslim. So that's an interesting thing when you are, seen as the not part of that nation, right? Benedict Anderson talked about, the nation as an imagined community. Who do we imagine to be part of the nation, and who do we think needs to be exiled from it? So this is the divide where Muslims land and are forced to either be the good Muslim or the bad Muslim, because that distinction, means that, it's the difference between whether you can, move about your life without being subject to scrutiny and surveillance and so on. That effect, that sort of panopticon of kind of always being surveilled, actually starts to become internalized by youth. Right? So they start to internalize that surveillance, and they start to become self-surveilling subjects. So I would often find when I talk to youth and I'd ask them something like, how did 9/11 affect you? And they would often say, well, it didn't affect me. I don't think it had any effect. And then I'd say, okay, so what are your MSA groups doing now? What are you guys up to? And they would say, well, we were going to go play paintball up north, but we decided not to because we don't want people to think we're a terrorist cell. Oh, okay, but 9/11 didn't affect you, right? Okay. Or, we were going to, we usually play Call of Duty, violent video games in the concourse. But we don't do that now because we want people to see us and think we're plotting an attack. Oh, okay, but 9/11 didn't affect you. This was just their normal. This wasn't something like they did not know a world before. This is just how you navigate the world if you're Muslim. I remember my son coming to me and saying, well, we want our MSA, we want to go into the Rouge. This is in Ontario. There's a park, a national park there. We want to go and have a bonfire. And I was like, no, you cannot do that. You cannot have a group of Muslim kids, brown kids in the woods lighting fires. Like, that's just going to raise all kinds of alarm bells, So I'm looking at that as a concerned parent, right? So these kinds of considerations are always part of how Muslims navigate, right? How they think about their actions and how they are going to be read by others. So there's that internalized self-surveillance that starts to happen, What am I taking with me to the airport? Do I have something that will make me look suspicious? Because we know, even if you have a Quran or you have an Islamic prayer written, a traveler's prayer, people have seen that and Muslims have had to be deplaned because that was considered a threat. You don't say things like Allahu Akbar or God is great if you're at the airport. You don't use the Islamic lexicon because that could get you pulled aside. So those are among the kind of ways that Muslims have learned to navigate and become self-surveilling. A couple of quotes from students here. Rania says that there's a designated counter-terrorist agent for the Muslim community and they want to work or have a good relationship with MSAs on every campus. I asked if this was only for Muslims, and he said, unfortunately, it is. The targeting happens everywhere. In our university, we've had experience with political movements, nothing huge, just suspicion. Securitization is a problem, but how do we figure out what's acceptable and what's not? It's so difficult, it's disturbing. So again, they're confused about, what can we do and how is it going to be read by others? And then Yusuf, actually, I won't read that because he goes on to talk about the bonfire and the deliberation of whether Muslim youth should be able to go into the woods and do things that other youth may do. But it's read very differently. So in conclusion, I wanted to just end here, but not again, similarly in my book ends on a chapter that looks at Muslim youth and resistance through the arts. I'm very personally inspired by the arts, and I think we all are in many ways. We started this evening with music, because it transports us somewhere, it makes us feel things. And I think, I've talked a lot about with my colleagues, something that I think is fundamentally true, that people really don't care about Islamophobia. I can stand here and give you facts and figures and tell you what's happening in all corners of this planet to Muslims, that is about genocide, that is about mass incarceration, that is about forms of imperialist violence and so on. But there really isn't much of a reaction to that. We realized in talking to my colleagues who are also scholars and researchers that there is an empathy gap when it comes to Muslims. But what fills that gap? It actually isn't the data, the facts and figures. I've showed you statistics, I've showed you the polls and things like that, and I can pull out other numbers. That doesn't fill that empathy gap. It's the stories that fill that gap, the storytelling that fills those gaps, because then people can begin to see Muslims as intelligible and relatable. And so I think that storytelling, and essentially the ethnography I do is a form of storytelling. It's telling the stories of these youth. But Muslim youth, cultural producers, are doing that storytelling themselves. And I think that that's a very powerful space for future transformation and for imagining alternative futures. That's what the arts allows us to do. And through storytelling, Muslim youth are finding ways to subvert the kinds of experiences that they've faced or present a new narrative. And so there's just 3 quick examples. One is a Muslim spoken word artist. She was really one of the first hijabi Muslims, Sophia Baig from Montreal, who was doing spoken word poetry and talking about Muslim women's experiences. Now there's many who do this work. On the other side, there's a poster for Conflict Relief, which is an Israeli-Palestinian comedy troupe. One of the founders was someone I interviewed in my study, and she's Palestinian from Canada, but went to the UK to be part of a theater school that was based on physical comedy, and found some Israeli students in that class, and they used to clash a lot about politics. But then they started to say, well, what are we doing? Why can't we come together and maybe create some kind of an intervention that uses theater to disarm people and have conversations about what's happening in the conflict there? So they did sketch comedy about what's going on in Israel and what's happening to Palestinians. Then they would go out in the audience and start discussions and debrief and have conversations, which was a kind of public pedagogy, right? It was a way of kind of educating people, but using the arts to allow people to sort of let down their guards and to think about things in different ways. And so I talk about that intervention in the book and their experiences. And then finally in the middle is a documentary called I Am Rohingya, A Genocide in 4 Acts. This was, first of all, a play done by Rohingya refugee youth in Kitchener, Ontario. And these were youth from about 8 to 20 years old, 15 youth, who actually were working with my son, who was working with a Muslim social services agency as an internship one summer. And he was also a university student, but also a filmmaker, actor, and he was in theater. And he was supposed to do workshops with them about, like don't do drugs, and here's how you kind of integrate into society. But he asked them, like, what do you guys want to actually do? And they're like, well, we want to tell our story. We want people to know what's happening to our people in our families, our community in Burma, and we want to talk about the genocide that our families have gone through. So he did an ethnography with them and talked to them and talked to their families, heard about their stories, and created a 4-act play based on their experience in the genocide, being pushed into the sea in boats, landing in Bangladesh, and then coming eventually to Canada. That became a documentary film called I Am Rohingya, A Genocide in 4 Acts, where these youth actually act out the violence that was perpetrated against their families and also show the resilience of these young people in challenging what their families have experienced. And it shows us the way Muslim childhood has become so politicized, but also how they've been able to find productive ways to engage with that and want to tell the world what's happening, because there's so much silence about these atrocities and about the genocides that are happening. So those are some of the artistic examples, and I'll just end here with, if it was only this easy, if we could just take a pill or, take two and call a Muslim in the morning Islamophobic. Unfortunately, it's not that easy, but I hope that this book has enlightened some of you and helped you think about Islamophobia in deeper ways so that we can all collectively look at the challenge before us in this country and elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jasmin, for an excellent, critical, and comprehensive presentation. We have some time for Q&A.
I'm wondering whether you think there's any problem with the term Islamophobia. It was the first question that came to my mind even before you mentioned that it is problematic to you because it uses the word phobia in it, which implies irrationality, and that is not exactly what it means. So the term, I don't know if that was generated by academia or by the media, but why is it being perpetuated? It was used in your own talk a lot of times. Why can't they find another term for it if it is in fact inaccurate, like the other forms of racism that you mentioned, which don't even refer to race?
Thank you for that question, but I think you didn't quite understand me because I was talking about why people are confused by the term Islamophobia. I am not saying we should dispense with the term Islamophobia at all. If we were just to talk about anti-Muslim racism, for example, what is it about Muslims that's distinct? There's 2 billion people in the world, right? It is that adherence to Islam. The fact that Islam is used so much within anti-Muslim subcultures as a means to vilify Muslims means that we have to keep the Islam in Islamophobia. I think that it becomes difficult for people who take the term very literally. And that's why it's difficult. That's why myself and other scholars have tried to unpack that term and define it in ways that we find, useful. So I don't believe with dispensing with the term at all. I think that we need to define it in a way that makes sense and that people can understand. So there's a big critique that, and the Islamophobia industry was one of the first to say, well, this term, no one knows what it means, we shouldn't use it, in a way to kind of say that, Islamophobia is not a real thing. And so, no, I resist those kinds of moves. And, anti-Muslim racism is, to me, a phenomenon that is part of the broader umbrella of Islamophobia because it speaks to the discrimination that is faced and enacted against Muslim bodies. But I do believe that Islamophobia, as I define it, as the fear or hatred of Muslims, not just sitting there alone, just as fear or hatred, but it's translated into individual, ideological, and systemic acts. Right? That's what I was trying to unpack here in my explanation of it, that is my definition of Islamophobia. So it takes that fear or that hatred and then it becomes translated into individual, ideological, and systemic manifestations. And so that allows us, if we just talk about fear or hatred or intolerance, those terms are not very helpful because there's no way to intervene. When we talk about hatred, we can't talk about the state as being complicit, right? Or intolerance. The state isn't complicit in intolerance. That is among individuals. So if we want to understand any form of oppression as having a systemic manifestation, as having an ideological manifestation, as well as individual, then we need to understand it in that broader dynamic. So the definition I use for Islamophobia could also be used to talk about racism. There's individual ideological systemic manifestations of racism as well. You're saying that the forms of racism that I'm talking about are not actually racism. I think if you understand racism in a very narrow way, maybe that might be true, but when we understand racism as being more broadly constructed through cultural forms of racism, through racism that is enacted through, it's not just biological racism, right, that we're talking about. So that's why those broader categories also work as part of the intersectional forms of racism that come together with Islamophobia. So no, I'm not trying to dispense with the term.
Well, your slides on the idea of conspiracy theories and taking over the country really piqued my interest. That brings us to the question, where do these ideas originate from? Because in the past few weeks, we've probably heard some news about the city council in Michigan that banned the pride flags in the United States, or there are some viral videos on the internet that a Muslim man saying that it's going to be a Muslim majority nation right in your face. My question is that, what do you think of it? Do you think of it as a propaganda campaign or some acts of a few individuals? So, and how can the Muslim community counter the effects of such widespread propaganda or circulation of such news?
Yes, social media and the internet are major sources of disinformation campaigns. When I was doing my research on the Islamophobia industry, I had to go down a gazillion rabbit holes, and I would often have to fact check things. And so sometimes I was just looking at information that I needed to know about certain Islamic, verse from the Quran. Immediately, I was directed to websites like Answering Islam. Those were the first hits, which were the Islamophobic propaganda sites. There's been a lot of research about how the algorithms get hijacked and you are immediately directed towards disinformation sites. So yes, there are propaganda campaigns that are out there. The viral videos, I think you're talking about, haven't seen those, but there's certainly lots of examples. And I don't know where those videos come from, but there's certainly been a lot of those assertions from places like Rebel Media, Faith Goldie talking about the Muslim invasion. Those are common tropes that are used, and those kinds of propaganda are out there in a lot of different forms. When that source of knowledge isn't challenged is how it becomes hegemonic, right? Hegemonic ideas are uncritically absorbed by the masses and aren't challenged because there's no counter-narrative. The fact that those ideas have started to gain a lot of traction more widely is definitely concerning. I'm not aware of the ones you're talking about, but those are examples. I've got many, many in my report on the Islamophobia industry that show the way the idea of the Muslim invader, the Trojan horse, the fifth column. I have an entire chapter that looks at about a dozen conspiracy theories that are that focus on Muslims, the demographic replacement, all of these kinds of theories, and I try and map some of the genealogies of those particular conspiracy theories as well. So I don't have time to go into them all, but we often think that those are things that you may hear in Europe or in the United States, but they are also being purveyed and propagated here in Canada as well by a number of sectors that reinforce and echo and amplify these ideas, which make them then seem a lot stronger.
I was wondering how you would factor in narratives like Ms. Marvel and Kamala Khan into a promotion of Islam or a way of uplifting mainstream ideas. Seems like the way that you're interacting with the arts is in a first-person experience, while things like Ms. Marvel is obviously very removed from reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Very good question. It's great to see now Muslim women superheroes and them becoming part of the Marvel universe, which is so popular, and that becomes part of a mainstream because we start to see a different narrative about Muslim girlhood or womanhood, and we need that because we just don't have those kinds of images. For too long, Hollywood's representation of Muslims has been through stock characters of oppressed backward women or harem girls and belly dancers, to men who are terrorists and suicide bombers and so on. We need to start having those other stories. Yeah, some of what I've focused on were people's own experiences and narratives that they were producing through the arts. But I think, starting to see that inclusion in more mainstream ways of stories like Miss Marvel. There's many others. There's a film festival happening here in Edmonton in 2 weeks, the Oscars Film Festival, that features the cultural production of Muslim filmmakers and artists. And so if anyone wants to check that out, that would be a good opportunity to see some of that. One of the films being featured is called Mustache, and it's done by an American filmmaker, but was filmed in Toronto, and my son was assistant director to that film, so he'll be there. And it's really just a story, a coming-of-age story of a young boy who grows up going to Islamic school and has to kind of struggle with his family culture and society around him. We need more of these stories, I think, to help fill that empathy gap.
You said that art is a kind of trajectory for Muslim people to kind of negotiate their identity, tell their stories. My question is, to what extent those stories are being heard? How hospitable are the listeners to those stories? And also how these storytellers can have narrative agency to narrate their kind of experiences, and also to what extent do you think they're being marginalized?
I had a somewhat related question. So I was wondering, when you talk about the power and agency in creating counter-public narratives of Muslim youth, I'm from India, and then when we look at how the current Indian government is stomping upon any possibility of having a counter-public narrative, how much reliance can we have on those kind of like self-driven, also like community-driven systems when the state and the system is making sure to stop all those channels?
I think both questions are really looking at the limited agency of artists who have to deal with lack of funding, state suppression, state control of the narrative, particularly in India, but the general lack of support for racialized artists in general. Muslim artists as well are not even sometimes getting the support from their communities because they're not encouraged to go into the arts. Be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, not an artist. And so that has to change because the storytellers are the ones that are going to imagine those alternative futures for us. And we need that space to be able to consider, other narratives, other ways of being, and promoting those ideas within wider publics, as limited as that can be because of the parameters of particular states and their agendas, or the limitations of not having the funding to do this kind of work. It's so limited for the arts in general, but especially for racialized storytellers. We're starting to see spaces of opening. So we're not seeing, a huge change, but we are starting to see spaces of subversion, small acts of subverting that dominant, paradigm that's out there. And it will take a lot, and it will take a lot more behind it. But this is a kind of emergent, I think, form of cultural production that we're starting to see that is starting to make its way in the mainstream. Shows like Rami, for example, I think are a great intervention. May not be everyone's cup of tea, but I think it's fantastic. Has won Golden Globes. People are watching. In Canada, we had Little Mosque on the Prairie. That was like the #1 comedy in Canada for a number of years. And, whether you liked it or you didn't like it, it was an important intervention in bringing Muslim stories to, a broader public and showing that Muslims can have a sense of humor. Actually, I did have interviews with youth about that show and their views on it. Unfortunately, it didn't make the cut for the book, but it was something that was part of that landscape that kind of, set the groundwork for other stories to start happening and for other storytellers. And so I think we need to continue to invest in that, and that we need to push the government to continue to invest in the arts, and I think have special programs for Muslim youth artists so that they can tell other stories that, aren't the stories the Islamophobia industry is telling.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank the Edmonton Council of Muslim Communities and the ECMC Chair, Dr. Madavi, for supporting this event, the Faculty of Arts, of course, for all the work and support. To Her Honor, the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, for opening us up in such a powerful way, and our speaker, Dr. Zine, for ending with the power of stories. I think it was a beautiful bookend, actually, to the entire event. Thank you so much. Thank you all. We will all go collectively together outside and continue our conversation. Thank you so much.